Thanks to Steve and to Kevin. One of the contextual issues throughout that conversation was the state of U.S. trade policy as we see it today. We are, as of last night, I think, fully, officially in a trade war with China. We just announced, the U.S. just announced $200 billion in new tariffs on a number of Chinese products. And that will certainly invite some kind of response from China. So to talk to us about all of that, we've got a fantastic group coming up. The moderator of this discussion is a friend of ours, Swanson, domestic correspondent who handles economic and trade issues for the New York Times. She'll be accompanied from left to right. I don't mean where they're sitting, I mean where they're positioned in the universe, by Scott Paul, a friend of ours who's the president of the Alliance for American Manufacturing, a joint venture between the steel workers and a number of steel companies who actually incubated EIG in their offices in the first couple years of our life. Second to that, we have Suzan DelBene, Congresswoman Suzan DelBene, the representative from Washington State, a friend as well, a former technology executive in Washington. I think I'm going to put Michael Steele next, political analyst for MSNBC, former lieutenant governor of Maryland, and the former chairman of the Republican National Committee, who also, I learned last night, does not like to eat beets. So that should be useful for this conversation. And then our friend Scott Lincicome, an international trade lawyer at White & Case and an adjunct scholar at the Cato Institute. Big welcome to our panel to talk about U.S. trade in an age of populism.
Well, thank you so much for joining me. My name is Swanson. I'm a reporter at the New York Times, and I'm delighted to chair this panel on trade in the age of populism with these distinguished panelists. Trade has obviously become one of the president's biggest policy focuses this year, and motivating that is this deeply held belief that globalization, offshoring, and China's entry into the trading system has hurt American workers. And in an effort to address that, the president has launched kind of an unprecedented number of trade measures this year, affecting nearly every industry and major global trading partner. And in the process, we're putting enormous pressure on the international trading system, constructed by his predecessors over many decades. So this is creating a lot of uncertainty and a lot of questions for me as a reporter. About the future of that system, about what the effect is going to be on businesses and the economy, and how voters are going to respond to this in the upcoming midterm elections. So thankfully, it's my job to ask rather than answer these tough questions. For that unenviable task, I'm going to turn to the distinguished panelists here. So I'll start with you, Congresswoman DelBene. And I wanted to ask first, how are these trade actions that we've seen recently affecting your constituents, and how is that shaping your views on what should be done?
Thank you. I represent a very diverse district in Northwest Washington State. Washington State's the most trade-dependent state in the country. 40% of our jobs are tied to trade. And my district is a combination of urban technology companies, a lot of biotech, then I have a lot of rural area and agriculture, an aluminum smelter in my district, so a little bit of everything, especially when we talk about trade. And the recent actions, I think, have been incredibly concerning. I'll give you an example. For cherries and you look at our agriculture products, but cherries and apples in particular, with respect to China, there was a 10% tariff on cherries to start out with. Then in April, as a result of the 232 tariffs, China increased those tariffs by 15%. So you went from 10% to 25%. And then most recently, another 25% were added. So now we have a 50% tariff on those products. So that's just one product, agricultural product in our region, but it tells you how quickly that's changed from a 10% tariff to a 50% tariff. We've got folks harvesting product right now. The uncertainty, as you mentioned, It's very, very difficult when people are trying to develop business relationships that go out many years. And right now we've seen more and more folks looking to other markets outside of the US for stability and certainty because they're not sure what's going to happen next. Even yesterday, the president announced increased tariffs on China. So what does that mean? We're going to go even higher, for example, on cherries. So that instability has a big impact, not just on agricultural producers, but agriculture definitely gets a lot of the retaliation. But across the board, we have a kind of integrated supply chain. If you look even at an aluminum smelter in my district, the tariffs on Canada and the EU are incredibly difficult. We have a problem with oversupply in China, and so we should be working in a multilateral way to address that issue. And instead of bringing partners together to address the actual problem, now we have an issue where those partners are actually feeling the result of tariffs, and that impacts products that are moving back and forth, that make, raw materials that are moving back and forth. So even for our aluminum smelter, the actions that have been taken haven't been helpful. They end up in a place where they actually hurt the economics behind the business and end up hurting our workers and jobs. So this is a critically important time, and it's hard to have trade policy, or I'd say even tariff policy out there with no plan or no idea of what success looks like or where we're headed. And I think that great uncertainty is going to be damaging for years to come.
Scott, you represent kind of a different constituency with steelworkers and manufacturers. And I know that you have felt that certain businesses, including the steel industry, have been demanding these actions for a long time. So are they getting what they wanted? Is it working? What do you think about the course right now?
It's a good question, and I think this goes to some of the roots of the issues, is that a lot of the challenges that the president is attempting to address have been around for a long time, and there's been pent-up demand, both from businesses with respect to intellectual property in China, from the steel industry with respect to the global overcapacity that's mostly coming from China, but that has bred a lot of bad behaviors among other countries, and just the loss of jobs that manufacturing workers have seen. 1 out of every 3 factory workers lost his or her job in the aughts, and a lot of that was due to Chinese imports. So there's a real problem here. There's been pent-up demand. I think one of the challenges is that there hadn't been an effective means to address any of this. The WTO is wholly incapable of addressing China's state-led capitalism. It's just not capable of doing it because it's on such a systemic scale. And I do agree that the president could be more careful, could be more targeted, and could be more strategic in terms of how he has done some of this. I also think that there are very capable hands like Ambassador Lighthizer who know what they want, who know what the results that they want, and can get there. The last thing that we should do, though, is pull the rug from under an effort when it's just getting started. I think that would be an enormous mistake. We have some leverage now. We need to be very careful about how that's exercised. I don't agree with the president that trade wars are easy to win, but I also don't think this is anything that resembles Smoot-Hawley 2.0. We're in a great economy. Corporations just got $1.5 trillion worth of tax cuts, and unemployment is incredibly low. If there was a time to use leverage, it's now, and it is important to get those results. And to me, the effort will all have been for naught if we don't either reform some of those anti-competitive practices, change the game on the ground, create that more level playing field. I think the outcome is really important. Tariffs for the sake of tariffs won't get us very far, but if they do result in some real change, then I will, then I'll be willing to give some more praise to the strategy.
Scott, in regards to manufacturing job loss and workers hurting, obviously people know when they're hurting, but I know you've written about some popular myths about trade. So do you think that, what do you think that people are getting wrong or policy makers are getting wrong about the causes? I imagine you might have some disagreements with our other Scott.
Yeah, I mean, I think I'll disagree on a few of the nuances. But, there is an underlying truth to the idea that the time from the mid-90s through the 2000s was a time of immense disruption for a lot of people, particularly in manufacturing. The question, though, is that because of trade? And if you look at the analyses, you find that trade played a part, but automation, technology, changing consumer tastes, that also played a role. And it didn't just occur in manufacturing, it occurred across the economic spectrum. So the question we have to ask is, well, okay, so we have this disruption, we have these individuals who really have suffered from it, how do you fix it? And that's where I strongly disagree with the president's approach that protective tariffs do anything to solve this problem. First, it's not going to do anything to solve the problem of automation and technological disruption. But beyond that, if you look throughout history, time and time and time again, that the United States has gone down this road of unilateralism, of tariff protectionism. It has caused an immense amount of pain for consuming industries, for American exporters and farmers. It has not led to the wholesale revival of the protected industries, and it has kind of undermined the United States' status as kind of a global leader in achieving the types of changes we want from, for example, Chinese industrial policy or intellectual property policies. So how do we fix it? Well, we also have some good history on how to fix some of these things. The first is going back to the workers, we need a broader adjustment assistance strategy. And it's not simply just giving dislocated workers a little bit of money. It's about establishing better educational policies. It's about figuring out how to help workers adapt throughout their lives and not simply have, with this old style 40-year career job. There needs to be more adaptability. We also need ways to help once that disruption occurs. But then on the trade side, we know what works. Our FTAs work in lowering trade barriers. They work in getting our trading partners to commit to more rigorous intellectual property practices or various rules. And the WTO, the multilateral trading system, actually does work when we try it. When the United States brings China to the WTO, we win, and China eventually complies for the most part. And we haven't really pursued that strategy to its fullest capability. So we know what can work, and we're not doing those things. And that's what's really so frustrating because, again, there is this nugget of truth in the hurt manufacturing jobs, in the disruption that has occurred in our economy, and we're pursuing the absolutely wrong-headed approach to getting to where we want to be.
And then in regards to the approach, Michael, you and I were talking a little bit earlier about the president's strategy of ramping up pressure on economic partners to force them into changing their actions. And that's something we're seeing today with the president's aggressive statements as he's headed to NATO as well. So what do you think about this president's bet that trading partners will capitulate? How is that strategy going to work out?
I think for the president, it is not just a workable strategy, but a working one. There was a program on television at one point called You Just Got Punked. And I think that's basically what the president's view of this particular policy approach is. He's going to punk our NATO and European allies under the belief that his hot rhetoric and fear-mongering and tirades, if you will force them to capitulate ultimately to what he has set down as the bargain. And there's a two-pronged approach to that strategy. One is domestic, the other is international. On the international side, it is reordering the economic chessboard. And we saw it going back to the campaign. So folks, there's really no need to be that surprised here because the one thing about Donald Trump, love him, hate him, like him, leave him, he tells you where he stands with you at all times. There is no guessing. And he made it very clear to NATO and others that we're going to make you honor the agreement, that the 2% that you said you would pay, you're going to pay. Now, that agreement is up to a 2026 timeline. The 2% is a goal, not a hard number, but that's not how he's positioning it. And so what it's done, as we have already seen, it begins to reorder the economic chessboard with an institution like NATO. Then you broaden that out to the European playing field, and with Brexit and other global economic events that are occurring, he recognizes there will come a point of desperation. As a New York real estate developer, he knows there's always a point in the deal where the other side gets desperate, and that's where he's going to make his deal. So he's setting up these pieces in a way which it is triangulating and forcing folks to a new reality, one that is very disruptive, one that is not consistent with past practices. On the domestic side, this is fodder for his base. They love it. He is the strong leader. He's the one who's pushing back on America being taken advantage of by our NATO and European allies on a whole host of issues, from foreign aid to trade deals. And the truth doesn't necessarily matter. So when you're looking at the Congresswoman's district and the reality on the ground there, that is wholly disconnected from the top line rhetoric about what the goals are and what the effort's going to be. So I think from a number of perspectives, the real test as we go into this new round of trade negotiations, which the president wants to be bilateral, not multilateral, which Europe and Asia largely wants to be multilateral, is going to see who blinks first. My bet is there'll be more blinking on the other side than on this side.
You mentioned his base really loving some of these actions. We've seen a really interesting inversion lately in Democratic and Republican support for trade agreements. A Pew survey in May showed that 46% of Republicans now say that trade agreements have been a bad thing for the U.S., while 67% of Democrats and democratically leaning independents said that they'd been a good thing, which is obviously the reverse of what we saw, just years ago. So I'm curious how you expect that to play out in the midterms. Do we expect some of these trade tensions to wrap up before the midterms, or is this, we have clashes brewing on a lot of different fronts right now? How do you, Michael, I'll start with you and then others can jump in as well.
I love the way you set that up, because how twisted is this new reality that we're in which Democrats sound like Republicans on trade and Republicans sound like Democrats used to sound on trade, and everybody thinks this is normal. And it ain't. It just isn't at all. It goes counter to the philosophical core for both parties. So that's the top line philosophical sort of reorientation. The bottom line is you're looking at the upcoming midterm elections in November, which is going to be hugely important for both parties, more so Democrats than Republicans, in the sense that the Democrats are trying to take power, at least in one house, so that they can then create a level playing field or a countermeasure, if you will, to the president setting up 2020. My bet is, again, going back to the base, and I think the Congressman would probably appreciate this, it's not going to play the way a lot of very smart people in Washington and capitals around the globe think it ought to play. In other words, that people will be so driven by the outcome of either a no NAFTA deal or a NAFTA deal that changes the landscape a little bit. TPP, people think that's something related to toilet paper. They don't know. And quite frankly, don't care, to be honest. Where they will care is more domestic-oriented issues that touch on their wallets, like healthcare. When healthcare premiums are announced beginning in late September, early October by the insurance industry, what consumers will be paying starting January 1, that will have a bigger impact on their pocketbooks, as opposed to what we may see as the beginning fallout of this erroneous trade policy of the president. Yes, farmers some are beginning to feel that, particularly if they're cherry farmers, and I'm a cherry consumer, so I'm not loving the idea of a 50% tariff. But in the balance, I'm going to be much more focused on the 90% increase in my healthcare premiums that's projected in my state of Maryland than I will be in a 25% increase in the cost of cherries.
Yeah. Would anyone else like to jump in?
I just want to say that I think that, a lot of things contributed to Trump's victory in 2016, Russia, a bunch of things, but trade was certainly part of that mix and the appeal to the working class in Pennsylvania, Ohio, Michigan, Wisconsin. I don't know how to allocate it, but it was a factor. So the risk here for Democrats, and because there has been a bit of this inversion, is that I think Trump is baiting Democrats to abandon the working class on a really core principle. And God bless Bill Clinton and Barack Obama. I supported both of them. In the eyes of the working class, they made things worse on trade, not better. And if Democrats are going to say we're opposed to the president's plan on Steele or on China or whatever, they better have a good plan, which is not going to the WTO, because that's not going to, there's no industrial worker who believes that's going to be an effective strategy. And so I think that there is a risk. I just spent also a week in rural Indiana, and yes, the farm groups are very upset about these tariffs, and there's lots of folks who are, but the average farmer, and they overwhelmingly voted for Trump. I mean, 70% in a lot of places, they're willing to give him a lot of slack on this. And the odds are the election comes before any pain that they're going to really see. And so I do think that, to your point, I think that this is going to be misread by a lot of folks in the media, but the facts out in the heartland are a lot different.
I think economic issues, I think to Michael's point, I think economic issues are key. And one of the biggest concerns I hear from folks across, and my district's a swing district. It was set up to be a swing district. I hear across the board concerns about kind of certainty, what kind of economic certainty looks like going forward. And it gets a lot back to what you were saying in terms of not just what's happening today, but what does our economy look like tomorrow, and am I going to be able to compete in that economy tomorrow as a worker or as a small business owner, as a farmer? And so it gets into trade policy and being able to compete globally, because in many of our markets, folks are competing globally. It gets into issues of skills and ability to feel like you have the skills that are required for jobs. We had, the Department of Labor said we had 6 million open jobs across the country. This is an old statistic, so it might have changed more recently. You look at that and you say, what are we going to do to make sure that people are getting the skills they need? Some of it's geographic dislocation, because we have areas that are thriving and areas that are struggling more. We've got the Seattle area, which is growing incredibly quickly, and then we have old timber towns that are struggling and aren't sure kind of what their future economy looks like. And so we need to address both of those. And I think everything has been kind of put, and especially in the last campaign, a lot of folks talked about trade as if it covered all of these issues. And I think we really have to be thoughtful about the impacts of automation and just economic disruption because of our economy working in a different way. And we don't talk about that at all. We don't, right now there's an effort, and a few folks like myself are really trying to push forward on what's the environment look like for workers? What do benefits look like? What do we need to, how do we make sure people are getting the education they need? These are all efforts that we should be focused on right now. And so I worry that that's a place where right now we're not moving forward in policy. And I think that's a place, and as a Democrat, there is an important opportunity that we're spending a lot of time working on that's been lost, and that is going to be very, very important to folks, because it's not just about today, it's also about what's going to happen 5 years and 10 years. And then the last thing I'll say on the trade policy and on the tariffs is Again, you can't come to closure if you don't know what success looks like. And if the president doesn't have a plan, can't articulate what he thinks he's trying to get from these actions, then I don't know how you get to a place where you close things down and help us move forward.
And so I'll address two things. One is on the polling data, that some of which you, and then second on what I think we might see before the midterms. So first, totally agree with what's been said already about trade simply not being a priority issue for the vast majority of Americans. If you look at the polls, Pew has done them, a lot of polling institutions have looked at voter priorities. Trade is never in the top 10. As much as I would love being a trade guy for people to care about my issue, they just really don't that much. Well, what does that lead to? That leads to that wild swing in support that we're talking about. Democrats are now free traders, Republicans are now kind of protectionist, and that is because for a large chunk of the electorate, a view on trade is the view on the president, or a view on a specific policy is a view on the politician pushing that policy, not just the president. And if you look at the historical trends from Gallup, Pew, the Chicago Council, you name it, I'm actually writing a paper on this right now, and it's hilarious. Obama's in office, Democrats are more free trade oriented if he's pushing free trade policies, and the exact opposite. Now Trump's here, and you see the Republicans taking on the view of Trump and Democrats and so forth. So you see the swings align pretty perfectly with who's in office. So that said, I do think that trade can play a role in the midterms and in the next election, depending on when we start seeing real pain from these policies. Because these policies are the president's policies. They were implemented at his discretion. They are his. This is not like gas prices or the stock market. These are his policies. And although major multinationals can withstand some of these pains by sourcing things in different places, small manufacturers who are dependent on imports or exports are going to get pummeled, and they're getting pummeled right now. Farmers are starting to see it, but wait till soybean harvest comes in October, right before the midterm elections. What's going to happen to those guys? And so while it might not be this overwhelming push that's going to affect the midterms, I think for a lot of voters who really are feeling those pains, it could push the needle a little bit.
Yeah, that's a great point, and I think it's one that especially comes up in the trade conflict with China, right? Because China is not a democracy, and in some ways does that better position them to withstand certain pressures, whereas in the United States you have very noisy constituents talking about the kind of pain that they're feeling. And it seems like China and on other trade fronts as well, countries are kind of waiting for their retaliatory measures to take effect and waiting for U.S. business itself to put pressure on the president to change his trade policy rather than trying to affect trade policy directly. So I'm curious, how well do you think that will work? How, do the rest of you agree with Scott that retaliation is going to cause this pain and force a change in policy? Or, Scott, you were mentioning these farmers that are giving the president a lot of leeway and saying, we want to give you time to make your strategy work.
Right. Well, we tend to focus on the short term here, and Anna, I imagine there's been days where you've written 3 different trade stories because of the president's various tweets and positions that he's taken. But if you broaden the view a bit, I mean, the odds are, and again, this assumes that there's not a massive escalation, I think, and I think that's important here. But yes, we have noisy constituencies, but we have the leverage. 1 out of every 5 Chinese exports heads to the United States. We're an irreplaceable market for those exports, which are a key driver still of China's growth. They're trying to boost internal consumption, but it's still really export driven. I'm not going to say that exports to China aren't important. I know they are for constituencies, but from a macro perspective, in a $19 trillion economy, we have the leverage here. And talking to these farmers, I mean, there were farmers who said, you know what, If I take a 5-10% cut in my soybean prices and we get real change, it'll be worth it. And to me, that was kind of surprising to hear. I will admit it. But again, I don't think that rural America is going to suddenly flock to Democrats who, these farmers want to keep the EPA out of their backyards and everything else. They're not going to do that. And so I do think that there's a fair amount of leeway for the president here. How he chooses to use it is going to be very, very important, and I do have concerns about that.
So just two quick additions. One is I think it's critical to understand it's not just about the foreign retaliation. Now, certainly that's a part of it, and I think that our trading partners have been pretty skillful in finding political pressure points in a lot of districts across the country. But it's also import-consuming industries. Modern manufacturing involves a lot of imported goods, and about half of everything we import are stuff that our manufacturers use to make other stuff. So that hits them not only in their bottom line costs, but it makes them less competitive versus their foreign competitors. So you actually could see pain that way as well. But the other thing is that where is the plan? So I read the same stories, I hear the same things about, Donald Trump supporters are willing to give him the benefit of the doubt, but how long are they willing to do that? Last night, when these new tariffs were announced on $200 billion worth of Chinese imports, Ways and Means Chair Kevin Brady, who's a Republican, issued a statement saying there is no plan. There are no China negotiations. There are no plans for China negotiations. So I agree that there is the benefit of the doubt, but at some point, that's going to run out. And again, when they start pulling soybeans out of the ground, that might be the time.
But I guess the question in terms of the upcoming elections, which is the most important thing in Washington right now, there is nothing else more important to that, which is why there will be, the only thing that will get done will be a Supreme Court nominee will get approved by the beginning or the middle of September. Other than that, big legislative issues with respect to trade and things like that will largely have a lot of rhetoric, but very little legislative action. Partly because Republicans are scared to death of the president. And the president is running anywhere between 75 and 90% approval in their respective congressional districts among their base Republicans. And they can't afford to upset that, particularly those who are still in primaries through the end of August. They don't want to have that base come out in a negative way. They need that base to come this fall. So to your point, Scott, there's going to, and I think they're both excellent points, it really boils down to the timing of when those things happen. My bet is we really won't begin to see and feel the real impact of this until probably second quarter next year. And why is that important? Because the presidential re-election will be firmly underway, and the presidential election opportunity for Democrats will be in full blossom. And then that then begins to bring some of these issues into alignment and focus at the time people are starting to really feel the impact of these policies. And so the bet is we get through the November elections, which is why I go back to the point trade will be less of a factor and healthcare will be more of a factor. And you get into next year, then those other things that touch people's wallets in the economy, particularly on the consumer side, which is an important piece that Trump doesn't talk about when he lambasts all, the bad trade deals and the disadvantage we have. Yes, we may be running a deficit on the manufacturing side, but on the consumption side, those who are consuming our products and the products that we are also helping to get out into the marketplace is a very different narrative. That's going to be interesting to watch.
Well, we have a few minutes here. I just wanted to ask you about stress on international organizations as well. Make sure we get to that. So the fear was that other countries would kind of follow the president's approach in his criticisms of the WTO and disregarding some global trade rules. But so far, we've actually seen a lot of countries bring cases at the WTO to challenge the president's trade cases and try to affirm the WTO's importance. So do you think that Mr. Trump's criticisms are pushing other countries together rather than breaking the multilateral system apart at this point, or have we just not seen these tensions kind of manifest themselves yet?
Well, I mean, clearly we've seen the CPTPP, right? Folks come together there. I do think that China has been willing to fill the vacuum that has been left in terms of agreements and step in and say, hey, we're willing to work with you if the U.S. isn't. And so that's very concerning in terms of what that might mean going forward in terms of trade relationships and the types of relationships we might have or be able to have. I think there was a comment that the Prime Minister of Singapore had made about if I can't trust you on agriculture and basically on trade, on services, then how can I trust you on national security and military issues? I mean, this is part of our overall international relationships, and to be in a place where people can't trust us on trade, can't feel even that we're going to keep those basic promises, whether it's not on trade or any other agreement that we might have, then it's unclear how we're going to have a good chance negotiating with folks, and whether they're going to believe that we're going to keep a deal, even if we made a deal. And so that, I think, is having, and will continue to have a broad impact internationally in many different ways, not just trade specifically.
And at the WTO, you're right, that so far our trading partners are trying to keep the multilateral trading system in decent shape. They are filing disputes, as you mentioned. The retaliation, for the most part, has been done under the guise of the WTO agreements, the Safeguards Agreement. And so there is that, so far, that attempt to maintain the system while the United States goes rogue for a little while. However, at some point, I fear that goodwill that our trading partners are giving the United States, that we've earned, I think, over 70 years or so, that goodwill is going to run out. And it could run out when we have decisions, for example, on the United States invocation of national security to protect various industries, especially if we do it for the auto industry. There's a current investigation on that right now. $300 billion worth of autos, imports, and parts, subject to a national security investigation. At some point, these stresses will, unfortunately, I fear, do real lasting damage. So far, it does seem contained, but I have really strong worries about how long they can hold up.
Does that take a few years to kind of...
Right. So the disputes right now on national security are just getting started. The WTO, we lawyers, we take a while. It's going to take a little bit to work through the system, but at some point you're going to have to adjudicate these claims. And if and when you do, will the United States simply not show up? Will they say, no, we've invoked national security, that's it, we're done? And what will our trading partners do in response? And what will that do to the system? If the national security exception of the WTO, it becomes this giant loophole that you can drive a truck through, sorry.
A 25%
25% duty truck through. Then how do you maintain the stability of the system? And oh, by the way, there's a similar provision in the services agreement, so we could start seeing national security protectionism for services. So you can see how this could all unravel, and it hasn't done that yet. And I'm not saying it's going to happen, but it certainly is a frightening thought that this institution that has been around since the 40s, that has done a lot of good for geopolitical stability, for our economic security, stability, and growth, what happens if that becomes marginalized or implodes?
I'm going to say something provocative, which is one of the best things that potentially could happen is for China to leave the WTO, because it has blatant disregard for the rules. Its state capitalism is unchecked. Again, it's a systemic problem, and it's not going to change. I mean, it's accelerating this with Made in China 2025. Let's remember the key violator here is China, and I don't think there's any disagreement about all of the array of unfair trade practices and anti-competitive practices that it has in place. I do think the Trump administration's strategy has both brought people together and torn them apart. I think on Steele, there's an effort by Europe and others to kind of quarantine China's excess capacity. So you see that playing out, and that's what has to happen. I mean, they're really angry that the U.S. has targeted them as well, and some of these countries are right to be unhappy about that. But they're taking their own steps as well that may force a solution. So I don't think the answer is for the U.S. to leave the WTO. But as long as China remains in the WTO, it's not going to work the way that it was originally intended.
Okay, great. All right, well, we're about out of time, so thank you very much. Thanks for your comments today.
Thank you.
Let's give a very, very big thank you to Anna Swanson, Scott Lincicome, Representative Suzan DelBene, Scott Paul, and Michael Steele. Michael, I just want you to stand here for a minute because I want you to know this guy is such a great friend. He came over here to do this. We started out another hotel, another conference dealing with Australia, 7:15 this morning. So he's done double duty in like a very short couple hours. So thank you, sir, for doing this. Really appreciate it. Thank you all. Thank you all, Anna. So a couple of housekeeping things. One, you see a lot of folks standing. And you are welcome to keep standing, or you may wander through the room. There are seats all the way up. Ignore any sign that says reserved. It's not reserved. It's for you. And if you have any, so there are seats up here in the front. Feel free to come down and take them. This is your house for the day, so don't be shy. Please take seats if you'd like, because we have a very, very full house. Secondly, I want to say that there are votes in Washington, and Cory Booker and Tim Scott, Senators Scott and Booker, are going to be here, but not at the time we told you. They're going to be here this afternoon. We're going to have a lightning round of very cool, notable Senate personalities: Senator Joe Manchin, Senator Cory Booker, Senator Tim Scott, Representative Joaquin Castro. They're going to be navigating votes, and we're going to spend the day as we would a family. When they arrive, we're going to put them on and have our important discussions with them, which means we get a little more time, and oftentimes that will lead to more time for questions and answers. And I see Nelson Cunningham right here. You're going to have room for, Nelson's always got a zinger to put forward, so we're going to do that. And now we're